Somewhere in a cave in northern Iraq, around 65,000 years ago, a group of Neanderthals did something that no animal on Earth had ever been recorded doing for its own kind on purpose. They took a body, someone they had known, someone who had eaten beside them and slept beside them. And instead of walking away from it, instead of leaving it where it fell the way every other creature does, they laid it down with what looks a lot like care. And then, according to one of the most argued over discoveries in all of archaeology, they may have covered it in flowers. That last part might not be true. We'll get to why. But the fact that scientists have spent 50 years fighting about it tells you something important. Because the question underneath the fight is one of the oldest questions our species has ever asked. What do you do when someone you love stops moving and never moves again? You have to understand how strange this problem actually is. For almost the entire history of life on this planet, death required no response at all. A fish dies and drifts to the bottom. A deer dies and the forest quietly takes it back. There is no ceremony, no grave, no goodbye, because for the animal standing next to the dead one has simply become part of the landscape. Meat or nothing. The living move on within minutes. And for most of human prehistory, we did exactly the same thing. There were no funerals, no cemeteries, no priests, no coffins, no headstones, no words spoken over the dead. A person died, and the body stayed where it was, and the group kept walking, because staying near a corpse meant predators and disease, and a smell that told every hungry thing for miles that something had died here. Leaving was not cruelty. Leaving was survival. And you should really sit with how dangerous a dead body was to these people, because it changes everything that comes next. A corpse is not a peaceful thing in the wild. Within a day, it begins to smell, and that smell carries to wolves, to big cats, to scavengers that would happily follow it straight into your camp. A body left too close could bring disease into a group with no medicine and no understanding of what was making them sick. By every rule of staying alive, the correct thing to do with the dead was to get away from them, fast, and never look back. Nature had spent millions of years teaching every living thing that lesson. The dead are a hazard. Move. So when a group of humans did the opposite, when they stopped and stayed and chose to spend time and effort on a body that could only hurt them, they were not just being sentimental. They were overriding one of the oldest survival instincts there is. They were letting a feeling beat a fact. And the fact that they did this again and again, all over the world, is the whole mystery we're chasing. So how did we get from that? From a body being nothing but a problem to walk away from, to 13,000 hand-carved ivory beads sewn onto a child laid gently in the ground? How did death go from an inconvenience to the single event that humans have built more art, more ritual, and more belief around than almost anything else? That is the story of this video, and it starts deeper in the past than almost anyone expected. Let's go back about 250,000 years, to a cave system in South Africa, down a passage so narrow that adult scientists had to be specially recruited for their small body size just to squeeze through it. At the bottom, in a chamber that has almost certainly never seen sunlight, researchers found the bones of a creature called Homo naledi. And Homo naledi was not us. It had a brain about the size of an orange, a third the size of yours. By every assumption we used to hold, it should not have been capable of anything we'd call a mind. And yet the bones were down there. Many of them. Bodies that seemed to have been placed deliberately in a spot that took real effort to reach in the dark. The team that found them made a claim that set the entire field on fire. They said Homo naledi buried its dead. 240,000 years ago. Maybe more. Now you should know that a lot of scientists do not accept this. The evidence is fiercely disputed, and some argue the bodies could have washed in, or fallen in, or been left there by some process that has nothing to do with grief or intention. This is not settled. But here is why it matters even as an argument. If a creature with a brain the size of an orange was carrying its dead into the deep dark on purpose, then the impulse we're tracing, the refusal to just walk away, might be far, far older than our species. It might not be a human invention at all. It might be something we inherited. So let's ask the harder question. What does it actually take to bury someone? Because when you slow it down, burial is not a simple act. It is a stack of ideas, and every layer of that stack is a small miracle. First, you have to look at a body that has stopped working and understand that this was a person, not meat. A person. Someone with a name, if names existed yet, and a place in the group that is now empty. Second, you have to care what happens to that empty place. You have to feel that leaving them for the hyenas is wrong. Not dangerous, wrong. Which means you are running some idea of dignity for a thing that can no longer thank you, reward you, or even know what you did. And third, and this is the strange one, you often have to believe on some level that the story isn't over. That the person is going somewhere or becoming something or still needs the things you're about to bury with them. You don't send someone off with tools and food and jewelry if you think they've simply stopped existing. You do that if you think they've got a journey ahead. Each of those is a leap. Stacked together, they're the foundation of every religion, every funeral, and every ghost story humans have ever told. And somewhere in the deep past, our ancestors started making all three leaps at once. Which brings us back to the Neanderthals and that cave in Iraq. The site is called Shanidar. And for decades, Shanidar was famous for one body in particular. A Neanderthal man buried, it seemed, on a bed of flowers. The evidence was pollen. When scientists analyzed the soil around the body, they found clumps of pollen from bright, colorful, blooming plants, arranged in a way that looked like someone had gathered wildflowers and laid them with the dead. It was a beautiful idea. A Neanderthal, one of the so-called brutes of the Ice Age, mourning a friend with a handful of flowers 65,000 years ago. And then other scientists looked closer and found a problem. There is a type of bee that burrows into the ground and stores pollen in exactly the kind of clusters that were found in the grave. The flowers, they argued, might not have been left by grieving Neanderthals at all. They might have been left by insects, thousands of years of them, tunneling through the dirt. So the flower burial became a warning, a lesson about how badly we want our ancestors to be tender and how easily that wanting can trick us. For a while, it looked like the whole story was dead. But here's the twist. In recent years, archaeologists went back to Shanidar and dug again with modern methods, and what they found underneath complicates the debunking. There are more bodies at Shanidar than anyone realized, clustered together in the same spot over a long stretch of time. One individual was laid behind a large vertical stone, almost like a marker. Whether or not there were ever flowers, something was drawing Neanderthals back to this exact place in the cave to lay their dead again and again. And that is not an accident of geology. That is a habit. And habits around the dead are the seed of ritual. Now I want to talk about a color, because if you look at ancient burials all over the world, different continents, different species of human, tens of thousands of years apart, one thing keeps showing up in the grave. Red. Specifically, red ochre. It's a natural pigment, an iron-rich earth that ranges from rusty orange to deep blood red, and ancient humans used it constantly. They ground it into powder. They painted it onto cave walls, and over they poured it into graves, dusting the body, packing it around the bones, in some cases so heavily that the soil is still stained after 20,000 years. Why red? We can't ask them, so we're guessing. But it's hard to ignore the most obvious answer. Red is the color of blood, and blood is the thing that leaves the body when life does. It's possible that ancient humans, watching the red drain out of the living, came to see red as the color of life itself, and that packing a grave with it was an attempt to give some of that life back, to send the dead into whatever comes next, not pale and empty, but red, warm, alive. We don't know if that's what they were thinking, but we know they did it, deliberately, across the entire span of the human story. Red ochre in the grave is one of the closest things we have to a universal human instinct about death. And now we come to the burial that, more than any other, shows just how far this instinct could go. It's in Russia, at a site called Sungir, and it's around 34,000 years old. In the ground at Sungir, archaeologists found a man and nearby 2 children laid head to head. And these people were not simply buried. They were dressed, covered, head to foot, in thousands upon thousands of tiny beads carved from mammoth ivory. When you count them all, across the graves, there are more than 13,000 beads. Sit with that number. Every single one of those beads had to be carved by hand from ivory using stone tools. When researchers tried to estimate how long that work would have taken, the answer came back in the thousands of hours of labor buried in the dirt on people who were dead. And there's a detail that makes it stranger and sadder. At least one of the children at Sungir appears to have had a physical condition, something that would have made life difficult. The bones suggest a body that struggled. And yet this was not a person the group discarded. This was a child they buried like royalty, wrapped in a fortune of ivory, sent into the dark with more wealth than most humans would touch in a lifetime. Think about what that means. 34,000 years ago, before farming, before cities, before writing, a group of Ice Age hunters looked at a dead child who could never hunt, never repay them, never do anything for them again, and decided that child was worth thousands of hours of the most precious material they had. That is not survival. Survival would have walked away. That is love, or something so close to it that the difference stops mattering. And Sungir is not alone in this. Because if you want to see the tenderness of ancient humans at its rawest, you don't look at the graves of the powerful. You look at the graves of the very young. For most of human history, losing a child was not rare. It was almost expected. In a world without medicine, without clean water, without any of the protections we take for granted, a huge share of children died before they ever grew up. You might think that a world where death came for children so often would grow numb to it, that a group losing infants year after year would stop feeling the loss so sharply. But the ground tells us the opposite. Some of the most careful, most heartbreaking burials we have ever found are the burials of babies. Tiny bodies laid on their sides as if they were only sleeping. Infants buried with beads, with tiny tools, with the wing of a bird, with 2 swan wings folded around a newborn who lived only a matter of days. In one grave, 2 infants were laid together and covered in so much red ochre that the earth around them still burns rust red. Whoever buried these children did not treat them as a loss the group had shrugged off. They treated them as something precious, ripped away too soon, and worth every ritual they knew how to give. That is the thing the graves keep telling us. No matter where we dig, the people who made them were not colder than us because death was closer to them. If anything, they had learned to grieve while grieving constantly, which might be the hardest kind of grief there is. But burial is only half the story, because not every culture put their dead in the ground, and some of the ways humans have dealt with a body are going to sound, to modern ears, deeply disturbing. Right up until you understand the thinking behind them. At a number of ancient sites, archaeologists have found human bones with cut marks on them. Deliberate ones. Marks left by stone tools on the skulls and the long bones, in patterns that match the way you'd process an animal for its meat and marrow. For a long time, the obvious conclusion was violence. War. Cannibalism as an act of desperation or cruelty. But some of these bones tell a gentler and more complicated story. In certain cases, the defleshing appears to be careful, almost respectful, and the bones were then kept or arranged, or in at least one famous case, the top of a human skull was shaped into a cup. This wasn't a stranger being eaten in a raid. In some places, this looks like a funeral, a way of taking the dead into the bodies of the living, so the person you lost quite literally becomes part of you. It's called endocannibalism, and to the people who practiced it, leaving a loved one to rot in the ground might have seemed like the cruel option. Why abandon them to the earth when you could keep them? Other cultures went the opposite direction entirely and gave their dead to the sky. In some parts of the world, the tradition was to place a body out in the open, high up, and let the birds and the elements take it apart, returning the person to the world rather than sealing them away from it. Different logic, same root. A body is not garbage to be hidden. It is a person who needs to be sent somewhere, by the right method, in the right way. And then there are the cultures that could not bear to send the dead away at all, and chose instead to keep them in the house. Around 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, in the ancient town of Jericho and places like it, people did something that stops you cold when you first hear it. When someone died, they would sometimes remove the skull, and then, using plaster, they would rebuild the face. They packed the features back onto the bone. They set shells into the eye sockets so the dead could seem to look back at you. And then they kept these plastered skulls in their homes, among the living, on display. It's easy to hear that and recoil. But turn it around. These were people who had lost a mother, a father, a child, and who could not accept a world where that face simply vanished forever. So they rebuilt it. They kept it close. They let grandmother stay in the room while the family ate and argued and slept. To them, that wasn't macabre. That was love refusing to let go. That was a family so unwilling to say goodbye that they found a way with their own hands to keep the dead looking back. Which brings us to the feeling underneath all of this. Grief. Because everything we've talked about, the beads, the ochre, the flowers, the skulls, all of it is scaffolding built around a single invisible thing, the pain of losing someone. And a fair question is, how do we know ancient humans felt that pain the way we do? How do we know it wasn't just practical, just cleanup, just getting a rotting body out of the way? We can't read their minds, but we can look at the animals. Because grief, it turns out, is not unique to us. Elephants will stand over the bones of their dead, touching them gently with their trunks, returning to the spot years later. They have been seen covering a fallen member of the herd with branches and dirt. Chimpanzees have been watched sitting with a dead companion, grooming a body that can no longer feel it, refusing to leave. A mother whale has been recorded carrying her dead calf through the ocean for days, unable to let the body sink. If elephants and whales and chimps, animals with no religion, no words, no concept of an afterlife, still feel the pull to stay with their dead, to touch them, to carry them, then the grief that drove ancient humans to bury and paint and keep their loved ones was not some sophisticated invention. It was old. It was built in. What our ancestors added was not the feeling. What they added was the response, the ritual, the meaning, the story wrapped around the pain. But there's still a question we've been dancing around, and it's the most important one of all. If caring for the dead was so costly, if it meant staying near danger, spending precious hours, burying food and tools and treasure you could have used, then why did it survive? Why didn't the groups who wasted less on the dead simply outlast the ones who wasted more? Evolution is supposed to be ruthless about this kind of thing. So how did the impulse to honor the dead not just survive, but spread across the entire planet? The answer, most likely, is that burying the dead was never really only about the dead. It was about the living. Think about what happens to a group of people when they stop, together, and lay one of their own in the ground. They are doing something in unison. They are agreeing, without needing to say it, that their people matter. That being part of this group means you will not be abandoned when you die, that someone will stay, that someone will mark the spot. And a person who believes that, deep down, is a person who will fight harder for the group, sacrifice more for it, trust it more completely. Ritual around death is a promise the living make to each other, spoken through the body of someone who can no longer hear it. We will not leave you, not even at the end. There's another theory, and it's a fascinating one. Some archaeologists have suggested that graves were among the first ways humans laid claim to a place. A grave is a permanent mark on the landscape that says, "My people were here. My mother is in this ground. This land is ours because our dead are in it." In a world with no fences, no maps, and no writing, the bodies of your ancestors might have been the very first deed of ownership, the first way of turning a patch of dirt into a home. The dead, in other words, may have helped invent the idea of belonging to a place at all. And once a group starts returning to the same spot to bury their people, something new appears in the world. Memory with an address. A location you go back to, not to hunt or to shelter, but to remember. The first cemeteries were not just holes in the ground. They were the first places on earth that existed purely for the mind and the heart. The first monuments to the idea that a person can be gone and still matter. Everything from the pyramids to the headstone in your local churchyard is descended from that one strange decision, made over and over in the deep past, to go back to where the dead were and stand there for a while. So caring for the dead didn't weaken the groups that did it. It bound them together, it rooted them to the land, and it gave them something no other animal has ever had: a reason to return. That is why it spread. That is why it never stopped. And that story, in the end, became the biggest idea our species ever had. Because look at what all of this is quietly pointing toward. You don't fill a grave with tools and food if you think the person is simply gone. You don't dress a dead child in a fortune of ivory beads if the child has stopped existing. You don't rebuild a face in plaster and set it in your home if you believe the person behind it is nowhere at all. Every one of these acts only makes sense if, somewhere in the mind of the people doing it, there was a flicker of a thought that would go on to shape all of human history. The thought that death might not be the end. We don't know when that idea was born. There was no single morning when a human stood over a grave and first thought the dead go somewhere. It seeped in slowly over tens of thousands of years, one buried tool and one handful of ochre at a time. But by the time our ancestors were sewing 13,000 beads onto the dead, the idea was there. The afterlife had been invented, or discovered depending on how you want to see it, and it would become the foundation of nearly every religion, every myth, and every hope humans have ever held about what waits on the other side of the dark. So let's come back to that cave in Iraq, and the Neanderthal who may or may not have been laid on a bed of flowers. In a way, it doesn't matter anymore whether the flowers were real, because the flowers were never really the point. The point is that we keep looking. The point is that for 65,000 years, we have been standing over our dead, refusing to just walk away, insisting, against all the cold logic of survival, that these bodies matter, that these people are not gone, that something should be done. Every other animal treats a corpse as part of the landscape. We are the creature that couldn't. Somewhere in the deep past, our ancestors looked at death and did the strangest, most human thing imaginable. They argued with it. They decorated it, buried it, ate it, rebuilt it, and told stories about it, all to avoid admitting the one thing the rest of nature accepts without a fight: that the dead are gone and the living move on. We never fully accepted that. We still haven't. And every grave you have ever stood beside, every funeral you have ever sat through, every name you have ever whispered to someone who can no longer hear it, is part of a conversation that started in the dark of a cave a very long time ago, and has never once stopped. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who likes the questions most people are afraid to ask. So subscribe and stick around, because next time we're going even deeper into the strange, forgotten world of the people who came before us.